Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. This is part 2 of my interview with epistemologist Jim Slagle, professor of philosophy at the University of Portland. We're diving right back into the conversation, so if you haven't listened to part 1, I recommend you do so first. You can find it at williamnava.podbean.com. Is there a way to avoid the naturalism skyhook without going to theism?
Yeah, Nagel does. Nagel is an atheist, an outspoken atheist, and he presents this argument against materialistic naturalism because he thinks you can broaden naturalism to include teleology. He thinks that there would be teleological laws, but that there isn't. It's teleology without intention, he says. So teleology isn't that? I tend to think of that without thinking too precisely about the definition. I tend to think of teleology as saying that there's intention, right? Right, yeah.
So what does that even mean, teleology
I don't
without
know,
intention?
and he's not sure he knows. He actually says that I'm not sure if you can make sense of this, but I don't see that it's blatantly self-contradictory. Mm-hmm. So he's going to keep developing that, I hope, because it's it's fascinating. I want to see where he goes with this, man. Mm-hmm. But he's very uncomfortable with theism. He's made that really clear. He's really brutally honest with himself. He says towards the end of his book, The Last Word, that he says something to the effect of, I'm made very uncomfortable by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know believe in God. He says, it's not just that I'm an atheist and I naturally hope that I'm right. It's that I hope there is not a God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And I gotta say, I love Nagel, partially because of that passage right there. People who agree with me are boring. I like reading atheists, okay? And Nagel is just fascinating. And so but he also recognizes that materialistic naturalism, at least, is problematic. And so he's trying to have a naturalism with teleology. And if he can do that, that would rebut all teleological arguments, because all the teleological arguments say that there's teleology. Best explanation of that is theology.
Right.
And if he's able to do that, then he can say we can have the teleology without the theology. So that's fascinating. I'm skeptical of his claims that he's going to be able to do that, because I can't get my mind around the idea of teleology without intent. Like you said, that's what what does it mean if it's teleology if there's not an intending agent involved?
Right. I
don't know what that means. But that's fascinating. And then you can have it against determinism. Karl Popper, I don't really know if he was an atheist, but I think he said that the concept of God does not add anything. So I think he was probably agnostic. I don't really know. But he had an epistemological skyhook against determinism. So, you can do that. Having said that, I am not sure. As I go further down the rabbit hole, I'm wondering if where it's going to lead me, whether it's going to lead me all the way to something like monotheism, or whether it's going to be broad enough to include idealism,
panpsychism would come.
Panpsychism, certainly, right, exactly. Panentheism or pantheism, or what C.S. Lewis called dualism, but not mind-body dualism. He meant like ditheism, like there's like Zoroastrianism, where you have one good God and one evil God. Mm-hmm. Things like Lewis specifically says all of these. That's all this argument shows. It just shows that it's not that materialistic monism is false, but it doesn't show that all these other. Once you abandon that, doesn't tell you where to go. Mm-hmm. Now, Plantinga tries to make it go to theism, and I'm not
monotheism.
Monotheism, right? And it might. I'm not sure.
Right.
So once again, ask me again in 10 years. We'll see.
Yeah, intuitively, it seems to me like you could say. I think you can probably avoid the epistemological skyhook with something other than a monotheistic God but it's going to be something that's going to have intention, whether it's just generally consciousness in everything, or
well, I'm not even sure you have to
many
go that
gods.
far. What about something? I mean, like we were talking about Hegel. What about Hegel's where intellection is kind of coming aware of itself? That might be a way to avoid it.
Right.
That might be successful, even though you're not talking about a God in the traditional sense. Although Hegel was one of my old professors wrote a book called Hegel's God, a counterfeit double, which is a very good book.
A counterfeit double?
Yeah. It's a good book. It's very, he's a continental philosopher, though. But it's nothing, I'm sorry, though. Despite the fact that he's a continental philosopher, it's a good book. Didn't mean to say that.
Well, actually, while we're on that topic, so you don't go through any Continental skyhooks in your book, I don't think.
No, not really.
First of all, is that just a kind of an accident of how you've been trained, or is there?
Yeah, I mean, I actually studied over in the University of Leuven in Belgium, which is Continental. So I had to take the Continental classes, and I'm one of those. I'm like a dog person who still really likes cats. So I'm an analytic philosopher who still really likes Continental philosophy. But this is some of the area. I mean, I have some areas that I want to look into, because this kind of argument has to play a role in Husserl's critique of psychologism, or Husserlian critiques of psychologism.
So can you say a bit about that? Or what is
psychologism? Just is the idea that you can just describe, that you can explain knowledge just from the standpoint of psychology. It was in many ways it was a forerunner of naturalized epistemology, and it ends up not being valid because you can't really make a distinction between true and false beliefs, because again, psychologistic forces would bring about false beliefs. They'd be fully explained. True beliefs would be fully explained. What more are you adding to the true belief? They're both brought about the same way. You have no way to make a distinction between the true and false, and that's not sufficient. You have to bring rationality into it. So that's one area that it has to play a role. And someone has actually emailed me, because in the book I say, if you know of other sources, contact me, because this thing is everywhere, but no one's brought it together yet. Well, okay, I did, but apart from me, no one else has brought it together. So I'm sure I missed all kinds of stuff. And other examples would be, like with postmodernism, a lot of the times they'll say everything is brought about by a power play. Like what you believe or what you assert or what you say you believe, it's just an attempt to gain power over others. Well, obviously, if that's true, that would be the case for that claim itself. That would be the case for what you're doing right now. That would be the case for everything. So obviously, it's not something that you could take universally. Or take Ricoeur's, he appeals to the masters of suspicion, right? Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. He says these guys are showing that things are not what they seem to be. The things that, that so beliefs are not what they seem to be. We think we're just believing these things reasonably, but actually there's so much else at work here that we should be skeptical about them until we have a reason to be favorable to them. But we already talked about that. You can't do that, because then any reason you have to be favorable to them would itself, you should be skeptical about it until you have a reason for it. So that just leads to a self-stultifying skepticism where you can't do anything or move anywhere.
Yeah, as far as the Continentals are concerned, there's one that I'm interested in, which is Habermas.
Right.
So I know that Habermas, for one, I know that he's engaged in certain criticisms of Adorno. So Adorno had like a critique of reason, basically, and I think, and Habermas put forward a kind of skyhook argument, saying, look, a critique of reason can only go so far. If you make it total,
right,
then you're defeating yourself.
Right.
He also has something else which I wanted to mention to you, which is Habermas has this thing called discourse ethics, which is very basically the idea that when we're discussing any kind of positions, we need to presuppose certain ethical positions, such as that, for example, I'm not going to threaten or attack you in order to get you to agree with me, right? And so the idea being that based on the necessary presumptions of dialogue, you can from that sort of deduce ethics, some ethics, right? Like any ethics, essentially any ethics contrary to that would be self-defeating, because in order to make it, you would need to be in a situation other than dialogue. What do you think? So that seems to me like an example of an argument that seems to have a similar structure as the skyhook, but it's not quite epistemological.
Right. It sounds like a transcendental argument, which you could see the skyhook as an extreme form of transcendental arguments. A transcendental argument just says that in addressing something, you end up having to you end up expressing a position on it, whether you mean to or not. You have to take a position on it, whether you want to or not.
Right.
Now, theoretically, you could avoid a transcendental argument by just not addressing it then. So someone who thinks, you can't address ethics without making certain claims about ethics, really. But you could just not address ethics then, right?
Right.
So it's self-defeating, but there's still a way out. There's still a way out. You can just not address the subject.
Right.
That's the route that the naturalized epistemologist takes in general. He's just saying all these. He's not going against skepticism. He's not giving you a reason not to accept skepticism. He's just giving you a reason to just sidestep it without needing to address it. That's what the whole naturalized epistemologist project is trying to do. And in Habermas, it sounds is doing something similar for ethics.
Right.
Now, with the epistemological skyhook, it gets stronger, because just by contemplating whether it's the case, you have a reason to think that it's not.
Right. So you don't have a way, like perhaps in the ethical case, you have a way out in saying, fine, I won't be in dialogue. This is just my private ethical position,
Right.
and if you try to discuss it with me, I'll try to force you to agree with it, which means we won't have dialogue, and that's fine.
There you go. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But in the epistemological case, even just by thinking the thing and thinking that you agree with it, you've already undermined it.
Just about considering it as a possibility.
Right.
Because in order for you to rationally inquire in your own mind as to whether it's a rational possibility, you have to be presupposing that you're potentially capable of being rational.
Right.
And if you're not potentially capable of being rational, then you have no basis for drawing the conclusion about it, or about anything else for that matter.
Right. Okay. While we're on the Continentals,
Yeah.
What I find really fascinating about this argument is that it's not self-refuting, it's self-defeating.
Right.
So actually, before I even go to what I wanted to say about the Continentals, I want to draw that out a little bit, because you talk about it in the book.
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference between self-refuting and self-defeating?
The distinction I make here, and this is not original. I mean, naming them that way is original to me, but the ideas are not original to me. What I mean by self-refutation would be something that's a logical contradiction, something that can't be true in any possible world. Okay, and so the example I gave, I think, is Frege's belief that there are sets, and that sets can be members of themselves. If both of those claims are true, then you get with Russell's paradox, where the set of sets that don't belong to themselves belongs to itself if it doesn't, and doesn't belong to itself if it does. So it's a contradiction.
Right.
So you can't have a set of sets that don't belong to themselves.
Yeah. So basically, it's something that just by the meanings of the words,
Right.
you already have a contradiction.
Right.
So I guess to give a sort of simple one, it would be like, this bachelor is married.
Right.
Like
Right.
that's self-refuting just because of what bachelor and married mean.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Now, self-defeating is not. There's still a necessity involved in it, but it's not as strict as that. Like take the claim that there are no beliefs. Well, there are plenty of possible worlds that have no beliefs. Worlds that have no life, worlds that have no where there are life but there are no conscious agents. All of these worlds are logically possible, but there are no possible worlds in where that claim is true, that there are no beliefs, and that someone believes it.
Right.
By believing it, you provide a counterexample to it. So just by considering the possibility, is this a world where there are no beliefs? Is this a world where is no contemplation? You can't do it, because by doing that, you're showing that you're not in that world. So there's a necessity involved there. It's not a logical contradiction, but there's still a necessity involved.
Right. So that's what I find really interesting about the argument. The argument doesn't really give you a reason to think that naturalism can't be the case.
Right, yeah.
It's just giving you a reason for why it's impossible to believe in it.
Right. It's like David Wiggins says the same thing about the skyhook as applied to Marxists. He says, maybe it's just the case. Yeah, I mean, if all of our beliefs are caused by our station in society or economic situation, and people apply it to Marxism itself and say, well, then Marxism is caused by that. Well, maybe that's just the way things are. It's like, yeah, that's true. Maybe that's the way things are. But then thinking that that might be the way things are is also produced by your station in society. You can never get outside the circle. And if you can't get outside the circle, then you can't assess any belief as potentially true. In assessing any belief as potentially true, you can't help but presuppose that they're not in the circle, that they're not just produced by these non-rational forces.
Right. You'd have to say something like, I'm right, but that just happened to be the case, though. It's not for any reason that I can tell you.
Now, I say in the conclusion, it's kind of hard. I mean, so it doesn't really give you a reason for thinking it's not true. It just shows that you can't believe it even if you want to. But it's kind of hard to imagine. I mean, how can that be true? I mean, it's interesting that you're not really giving a reason for it to be false, but just by thinking, oh, so maybe it is true. No, you're assuming it's not true when you say that.
Right.
Well, let me just think about the possibility that it's true. You're assuming that it's not true when you think about that.
Right. So in a sense, it is giving you a reason to think it's not true because it seems so obvious that we do have beliefs and there's no way around, So it's a reason to think it's not true because if it weren't true, then you wouldn't have beliefs either. And that seems to obviously be true that we do have beliefs.
Right. And well, the eliminativist would say, no, we don't have beliefs anyway. But the argument's presented against eliminative materialism just as easily, I think.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably so eliminative. So just to be clear, eliminative materialism being just the view that there nothing exists other than just physical stuff. Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's probably seems to me the position that's most vulnerable.
Yeah, although as I've tried to find a simple expression of the argument that also applies to eliminative materialism, and I keep having to I have one argument for everything else and then one version of the argument for eliminative materialism. I can't find a version of it that applies just across the board. So I'll keep working on that.
Why is that? What makes having to go for eliminative materialism, makes it different than others?
Well, for example, Plantinga's argument is based on what we were talking about, depictive representations, depictors that have propositional content, beliefs have propositional content. And his argument is based on this. But the eliminative materialist just says there are no beliefs in the first place.
Right.
So you're not showing that, showing that your beliefs would probably be false on naturalism. The eliminative materialist says, what beliefs? What are you talking about?
So you kind of have to translate the argument into the eliminative materialist terms in which there are no beliefs anyway, so why are we even talking about that?
Yeah. Okay. But a lot of people do. For a lot of people, they see it really blatantly applying to eliminative materialism.
Right.
I think Paul Churchland wrote somewhere that when he first presented his essay, Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes, like in 1980 or something, one of the first questions put to him was, do you believe what you're saying about this? Are you asking us to believe it? And do you think eliminative materialism is true? Because truth is one of the things scheduled for elimination in eliminative materialism. And, he would have to say, no, I don't believe it. I'm not asking you to believe it, and it's not true at any rate.
Right.
But that's a hard point.
In some sense, you have to admire biting all those bullets.
Yeah. Well, I think they have a way out of that. I think they do have a successful way out of that, but then it just comes up at the next level. So.
Right. So the reason I wanted to talk a bit more about the Continentals is that one way out, which is a very tough way, but it's worth exploring, is just biting the skeptical bullet and saying, yes, let's just accept skepticism. yes, I don't have beliefs, and yes, I don't even believe what I'm saying right now.
Yeah.
Right? That's like to make something viable out of that.
Yeah.
And I think probably, as far as I know, the position that comes closest to being able to handle something like that is existentialism, which starts us off with we're in an absurd situation anyway.
Yeah.
Right? And so existentialism is like a way of dealing with that.
Right.
So, when I think, for example, of the myth of Sisyphus. So the myth of Sisyphus, an essay by Albert Camus, one of the most famous existentialist essays, and he describes Sisyphus having to roll up the boulder up the mountain, and then, rolls back down. He goes back up and gets it. And he's condemned to do that for eternity, and he's aware of it.
Right, and that's the human condition.
Right. And and Camus says something like that he imagines Sisyphus happy. That he imagines Sisyphus being able to, make the existentialist move and find radical freedom in being stuck in that situation,
right,
and create it as the meaning for his life. And because he has created it himself, even though what he physically has to do is this repetitive act for the rest of eternity, he's created it as the meaning of his life, and he can be fulfilled in that.
Right.
So, the reason this reminds me of the skyhook, or of a way of dealing with the skyhook, is that I think by describing the Sisyphus situation, Camus has basically put forward a determinist kind of situation, right? Like Sisyphus cannot get out of this. He cannot make a different choice other than to roll the boulder up the hill.
Right.
So Camus is saying, if for whatever reason we find ourselves in a situation where it seems like we don't have options as far as our physical reality, if it actually seems like we're predetermined to do what we're going to do, we can still take an attitude that'll sort of free us and allow us to kind of deal with this. So first of all, do you think that there's any viability in taking this kind of attitude as a way of just confronting the skepticism that the skyhook seems to face you with?
Well, I understand that. I mean, it's very similar to Nietzsche's eternal return of the same, right? I mean, Nietzsche's idea is that you're constantly going to relive your life with all of the mistakes, all the glories, but all the errors, and you have to revel in that and choose to make those mistakes each time with no hope of ever changing it. And, I mean, I love Nietzsche. Nietzsche is my favorite philosopher. I love Nietzsche. It sounds to me like Nietzsche's trying to talk himself into enjoying hell. And I think Camus not that. I mean, it took until Camus for someone to think that Sisyphus might like what he's doing. Everybody else said, yeah, that would be hell, right? And I understand that. Trying to make the best of a bad situation is one thing, but it's trying to take let's have a subjective. There are no objective attitudes, so let's take a subjective one, and any subjective attitude is as good as any other. Well, I'm not sure there aren't objective attitudes, because otherwise people wouldn't have recognized universally before Camus that Sisyphus was in a bad situation. But you're asking, can you just bite the bullet, just accept the skepticism? And I just don't think you can, because even if, like the existentialist saying that we're starting from an absurd position, like, okay, well, what do you do with that? So therefore, no, there is no therefore.
Right.
That would only follow if you had rationality, and you're claiming that you don't have rationality. So when you just start from the absurd position, well, why do you think you're in an absurd position? Well, because, no, stop. You don't get to do that. Because in order to assess the situation as being absurd, you're assuming that you have rationality and that you can assess it correctly. So I don't think you can sit in the skepticism, because just by considering the skeptical position as a potential, you're presupposing that it's not the case.
Right.
So I don't think you can get there. I don't think you can do it.
So, yeah, I think that seems right. I mean, when I picture, there's that key moment where Camus says, despite the fact that he has no other choices, I picture Sisyphus happy.
Yeah.
Why? Because he makes this choice to give his life this meaning,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, I mean, and that if he really can freely make that choice, then we're not actually in a fully deterministic situation.
Yeah, that's true. That's
right?
a good point. Yeah.
And that's another thing that, you know, the existentialist kind of encourages you to take a certain attitude toward being in the absurd, but, you know, it doesn't really account for why you would be metaphysically free to do so.
Yeah. Well, the whole situation is like Groundhog Day. Bill Murray, Groundhog Day.
Right.
I mean, he starts living the same day, and at first he revels in it because there's no consequences. Then pretty soon he realizes that there's no meaning,
Mm-hmm.
and he starts despairing.
Mm-hmm.
But then eventually he just says, well, I'll just make the day good, and then even though I have to redo the same things the next day, I'll just redo it again and again. But I think he would have tired of that just as quickly as he would have tired of the indulging himself. Because if there's no objective ultimate meaning to what he's doing, there's no reason to do that as opposed to, let's see if I can cause a nuclear war every morning. Right? There's no objective reason to prefer one over the other. And we can't sit comfortably in that, right? I mean, part of the problem here is whether we can just sit back and not make any objective claims. But I think part of the consequence of the skyhook is that any attempt to just be subjective ultimately still makes objective presuppositions. You cannot avoid the possibility of objective positions.
So, in your book, there's a couple of places where you talk about relativism and subjectivism. So it seems like we're kind of in this territory. What does the skyhook have to say about relativism and subjectivism?
Well, as the argument, it would say that you could just go directly to skepticism and then present the problem. But for some of them, they say that naturalism would lead to relativism,
Mm-hmm.
and that the particular forms of relativism that it would lead to skepticism. Who was it? Roger Scruton said something to the effect of, someone who tells you that all things are merely relative is asking you not to believe him. So don't.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great quote. That's exactly right. I can't, maybe they're smarter than me. I can't get my head around that.
Mm-hmm.
If they're saying everything we do is completely subjective, I think, well, then what you just said is completely subjective. And if what you just said is completely subjective, then it's not objectively true, right?
Right.
If it's not objectively true, then it might be that there are objective truths.
Right. Then you have nothing to compel me with, right?
Right.
I mean, essentially, why should I listen to you just because you're making sounds?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Switching gears a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Why Skyhook?
Why the name Skyhook?
Yeah.
Oh, I got that from Dennett, who I think must have gotten it from Richard Rorty a few years before him. But Dennett, Daniel Dennett gives Dennett is, I love Dennett, okay? He's really clever. I don't want to say anything negative, but I'll just say he's really clever. And he takes this image of cranes versus skyhooks. A crane builds from the ground up, on solid foundation. A skyhook is reaching down from something that has no basis. And the idea of a skyhook, he says, is absurd. You can't make a skyhook. There aren't skyhooks. And
so a skyhook is this thing sort of from on high that has no foundation.
That has no foundation. It's reaching down to pull something up.
Mm-hmm.
He says there are no skyhooks. There are only cranes. And he says we have to explain mind in terms of cranes. And
this is similar to the image of the guy who pulls himself out of the swamp by his own hair.
Yeah, actually, Baron von Munchausen. I actually toyed with the idea of calling it something like a bootstrap argument, but that term was already taken for 1,000 other things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Munchausen one is interesting because it's also used as a metaphor for a skeptical argument, right? There's the Munchausen trilemma.
Right, the Munchausen trilemma, which actually plays a part in my next book. Although I use Agrippa's trilemma, but it's the same thing.
Right.
So, I mean, Dennett's making this, he's saying that we have to explain mind in terms of non-mental properties, about material physical reality, because that's the ground. and there's no higher reality to reach down and pull up, and so you can't explain the mind in mental terms. You've got to describe it in material terms. Because if you explain it in mental terms, you're presupposing, you're begging the question about what you're using mental terms to explain mentality. Mm-hmm. Well, that's just circular. And now the whole claim of the skyhook is that you really can't explain mentality in concepts that are more primitive, because if insofar as you do, it ends up being self-defeating. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying we're starting with an epistemological. The first step we take is an epistemological skyhook. Maybe everything after that is a crane. That's fine, but the first step has to be a skyhook. Dennett does that whether he intends to or not. And Dennett, I mean, he admits that his position is an extreme one. He defends it very adroitly, in my assessment anyway. But he intends, when I'm saying he's clever, I'm saying that he's basically taken a ridiculous concept to try to make fun of people who disagree with him, but specifically theism. Right. Because Dennett, despite his claims, he clearly has nothing but contempt for theism. And so I'm just taking something that he intended as a slur, and I'm turning it around to be something positive, I hope.
So do you think that, well, in Dennett's case, that he is presupposing that the material world is that grounding? Is that the sort of problem with Dennett's
that's
approach?
part of the problem, because he says we can't explain the mind in mental terms because that begs the question. It's like, well, what we're trying to explain is part of what we're asking. So Dennett is assuming that mind is what has to be explained, and it has to be explained in terms of matter. But that's begging the question.
Right.
Dennett himself is begging the question. In accusing others of, it's really ironic that in accusing others of begging the question, he is begging the question in that instance.
Right.
Now I say this, but I think it's an understandable way to move. I'm not saying it's ridiculous. You understand? You explain mind in terms of matter. People have been doing that for a long time. I mean, a recent book by Richard Fumerton, Knowledge and the Case for Dualism, he makes an important point. He says that our awareness of matter and of the physical world is derived. What we have immediate awareness of is ourselves as minds. And I think that's kind of what the epistemological skyhook is pointing to, that the mental has to be the ground of reality is mental. There might be others. There might be other grounds. So it might be dualistic with mind and matter. It might be pluralistic with 1,000 other things. It might just be monistic. Everything is derived of matter, of mind. Right. But the ground of reality has to be mental. It has to start with mentality.
So there's a kind of I've seen in the history of philosophy in general, and certainly in the analytic tradition, mm-hmm. There are people who just seem to by disposition want to ground things in the scientific kind of picture, and then there are people who seem to, again, just by disposition, want to ground things in phenomenon. Right. There are even if I think back to the positivists and the logical empiricists, they all either wanted to say sense data and phenomena, a kind of quantified version of perceptual phenomenon. That's how we have to ground everything. We have to describe everything in terms of that. Yeah. And then you had other people who say, no, the scientific picture has been the most reliable. The sort of epistemologically humble thing to do is just start from a scientific picture and sort of speak that language and describe things in that way. Would you say that the skyhook, one of the ways to interpret it, is as an argument for why we should be starting from phenomenon as opposed to material scientific picture?
You could, yeah. I mean, the problem with saying that science is extraordinarily successful, which of course is true, and so therefore we should just do everything in terms of science. But there's no scientific claim that since there is scientific knowledge, that's the only kind of knowledge. That's not a scientific claim. I mean, if somebody comes up to you and says, well, science proves this, science proves this, you don't have anything comparable in philosophy or theology or whatever. I mean, the proper response is, but science doesn't tell you that. Science itself is not telling you that only science is valid. What the epistemological skyhook does is shows that it doesn't call these things into question. It just challenges whether they can be the whole story. So it's not challenging any scientific claims. It's not challenging whether science is an incredible source of knowledge. Of course it is. It's just saying you can't take it all the way. And that's why I focused on the last 150 years. Because for a lot of people, I mean, I gave planning a grief for focusing on evolution, but what did I do? I focused on the argument since Darwin, right? People do that because as soon as you had Darwin, you had T.H. Huxley and others suggesting that this explains everything about the mind and everything else. It's a complete explanation. And people emerged fairly quickly saying, well, if that's the complete explanation, that it would undermine reason itself, including the reasoning by which we arrive at evolution. So obviously it can't be the whole story. So that's how it should be taken. It's not either 100% science and 0% anything else, or vice versa. Mm-hmm. It's like you can have 99% science, but there's still more to be known. And that's why Nagel is so darn interesting. I mean, his whole premise is that if you get to know every objective fact about something, you still don't know all of the subjective facts. Like, what is it like to be a bat, right? You'd never, even if you knew every objective thing about batness, you wouldn't know the subjective knowledge of it. So Nagel is just fascinating in that regard.
So it seems then that the skyhook says, we need something else to exist other than the material, and we've talked about what that might be, whether it should be theism or not. Mm-hmm. What is it? Does it have to be something mental? So, like, is there a version of the skyhook that says something like, dualism as traditionally understood, in which mind is a separate kind of substance as matter? Is there a skyhook that would argue for that kind of dualism?
You probably could do that. I mean, again, with Nagel, I mean, by mental, I'm using that in the common sense way, I'm not using it as a technical term. Mm-hmm. Like Nagel would say that there must be teleological laws, and that I would call that mental, right, even though he's specifically saying it's teleology without intention. Right. But it's something that we would normally associate with intention. Intentionality is mental, so therefore, that's all I'm saying right there. Right. So yes, you can avoid. I think ultimately, it's the skyhook is pointing to a ground level of reality that is not the material. There has to be something logically prior, or at least logically equivalent. I mean, it doesn't have to be prior, but there could be two sources, right? But the material can't come logically prior to the mental. That's all I'm saying.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit again. Would you say that something like materialism is the orthodoxy in the academy?
Yeah, naturalism, something like that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It depends on who you talk to, but yeah, it strikes me that way. Mm-hmm. But I'm not aware of any polls taken, so I can't say that with confidence.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, how do you find that to be in terms of the culture of being an academic philosopher? Like, do you think that people such as yourself who write about theism or who have an anti-naturalist position have any kind of difficulty, being taken seriously? Is there a kind of cultural thing there at all?
If there is, I haven't encountered it, or at least I haven't become aware of it. Maybe people are always sniggering behind my back. It's behind my back, so it doesn't do me any harm. I don't think so. I mean, look, there are fads in academia and in philosophy and everything else. Things that are, if you have a revolutionary idea that doesn't fit in with the contemporary fads in philosophy, it's just not going to be seen as important.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily a hostile thing. I mean, I have confidence in my peers to sift the wheat from the chaff. So
Mm-hmm.
So there might be. I can't say that there isn't, but I'm not aware of it if there is. I haven't experienced it personally.
Okay. Now you mentioned that this is an old argument. So you said you focused on the last 150 years, but it goes to before that.
Yeah.
I mean, in your book, you give the first or the oldest version that you go through is Epicurus.
Right.
But this is probably, I think your book is probably the first time that a comprehensive study of it has been done.
As far as I know, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I encountered your book basically because I was interested in this argument, and I was just Googling key terms and trying to find a book about this argument. And yours was the only one that I found. You're the only one. Yours was the only one that sort of came up. I had never heard of you or anything like that. I just when I typed in sort of related terms, it was all that. Right. Your book was the only thing that came up. So why do you think that is? It seems like such a fundamental argument.
Well, gosh, yeah, it seems that way to me too. I'm kind of. It might be that we're just chasing after a ghost. Maybe you and I are wrong. Okay, that's certainly possible. But yeah, it seems like it's making an important point. Maybe part of it is that it just hasn't been noticed. That it just may be under the surface, and so nobody has noticed it. It might be because it's seen as a common sense level argument and not worthy of serious philosophical reflection.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your book that there have been places, there have been people who have sort of referred to it somewhat dismissively.
Yeah. And
not really gone too much into it.
Right.
Why do you think that is? What about it?
That might be because of C.S. Lewis. Mm-hmm. Because C.S. Lewis, like I said, he taught philosophy at Oxford, but he wasn't technically a philosopher himself. He was an expert in medieval and Renaissance literature. And he wasn't writing for academics. He was writing for the common person, right? So, and anyway, when people hear C.S. Lewis, they think Narnia, and that's all they think. Mm-hmm. So they're not aware of this. He's got some deep stuff that he writes about.
Yeah.
I mean, The Abolition of Man is one of the sharpest critiques of culture you will ever read. It's just an amazing book. And but people are just dismissive of this, and they think, yeah, this is just a superficial argument. I think that might be, I mentioned this at the beginning, I said it might be that the argument is seen as superficial and not having any depth. And I can understand that because it does seem to be an obvious argument in that regard. Mm-hmm. But I think it does have depth. I think it has a lot more depth than people are giving it credit for, at least these people who reject it. I mean, I'd like to, after I have like a list of books I'm planning to write, right? I mean, they're books I want to read, and nobody's written them, so I have to write them in order to read them.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to do eventually is kind of reverse engineer the argument into a full theory of knowledge. Mm-hmm. Because it seems to me you can do that. It seems fascinating to me. And
so start kind of with the epistemological skyhook as your kind of transcendental bridge.
Right.
As your way to first knowledge, right? In order, if we know anything, then we must know this that follows from the skyhook, and then from there you can kind of start building.
And it seems to me that's very important because it's basically Descartes' project in reverse. Mm-hmm. I mean, A.C. Ewing in his book Value and Reality, he just briefly presents a skyhook, and then specifically says this is like Descartes in reverse. Yeah, it is. It's exactly right. It's Descartes in reverse.
Can you say a bit more about that? What makes it Descartes in reverse?
Well, Descartes trying to say let's get down to the ground level and build up, and so he says, okay, the ground level. Is there anything I literally cannot doubt? And it comes with the cogito. I can't doubt that I exist. I think, therefore, I am. And from that, he builds up to the next level, which he says is God. Mm-hmm. And once God exists, then I have a reason to trust my senses. And when I have a reason to trust my senses, I have the world and all the rights pertaining thereunto. Mm-hmm. And that's it's speculative, but the point is really none of those steps are really that solid. I mean, people have denied that they exist. Hume seemed to deny that he existed. when sitting in his own study, and then when he looked up, he said, "What the hell am I talking about? I'm going to go play backgammon." Peter Unger, who is a contemporary skeptic who you should read, brilliant. Oh my gosh, scary smart.
He's somebody that I'm familiar with because I studied the Varieties paradox a bit.
Oh yeah.
And that's one of his reasons for claiming that he doesn't exist, is that it solves the vagueness problem.
Yeah. I mean, he can't be right, but gosh, he's so hard to find out how he's wrong. He's brilliant. Gosh. So you have some people who deny this kind of thing, but even so, the next step up from God, he basically gives an ontological argument, those arguments are sometimes called the one argument that's never convinced anybody, right? And then he goes but ignoring that, he goes from the existence of God to the reliability of our senses. Well, that's possible, but it's not certain.
Right.
So really, this foundation, there's way too many options left open, and it doesn't really establish what he's hoping to establish. And I think if I were to accomplish this, you'd start from and I think this is what planning it does. Instead of starting at the bottom and trying to build up to knowledge, planning it starts with knowledge and builds down to what must be presupposed, and it ends up being not too far from what Descartes is saying. There has to be a God, there has to be a physical world. There has to be a God that designed our cognitive faculties to be this way.
Right. There has to be my mind.
Right. Exactly. Right. I think planning is doing that, and so I think if you put this in the Cartesian context, it's very valuable. And if the epistemological skyhook isn't valuable, then why is Descartes' project valuable? Which it obviously is. Now I'm saying this, my gosh, I'm realizing I'm putting myself on a level with Descartes. I apologize. But, it just seems like it's very interesting to me, and I think it's very worthy of philosophical attention.
Yeah, it is interesting that I think the way that the skyhook tries to refute the possibility of skepticism is very similar to the way that Descartes' cogito tries to refute the possibility of personal non-existence.
Right.
There's sort of parallel arguments in that.
Very much.
In that sense. Okay, so you mentioned your next book at some point when we were talking about the Agrippan trilemma.
Right.
Do you want to say a bit about that?
Well, I'm not giving a full-length book on planning his argument, which hasn't been done. Even Planning didn't write a full book on his argument.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's great.
So I'm writing a full-length book on his argument. I'm trying to situate it in the epistemological context. So the first 3 chapters, I have a chapter on Descartes' epistemology, and then Quine's naturalized epistemology, and then Planning's naturalized epistemology, supernatural naturalized epistemology.
Right.
And then how his argument emerges from there, and all this, and then all the objections to it, which are formidable and many. So that's what I'm working on right now.
And how does that touch on the Agrippan trilemma?
The first chapter, when I go over Descartes' epistemology, I look at the Agrippan trilemma, where you have 3 options. Really, it's more than this, but I simplify it. So you have, when you ask, how is it that you know X? Well, I know it because of Y. How is it that you know Y? Because of Z. How is it that you know Z? And then the answer can be, you just know it. That's foundationalism. Or you can say, I know Z because of X, and Y and Z and X and Y and Z, and that's coherentism. Right. Or you can just keep going on to infinity, giving new answers every time.
Okay. Yeah.
And if you never stop, because that would be foundationalism, and you never repeat, because that would be coherentism, and that's infinitism. And the only guy I know who defends that is Peter Klein. And I'm sure he has
Peter Klein.
Mm-hmm.
So just to summarize, the idea is, if I want to say that I know X, right? X is any proposition, then I must have some justification, some reason for believing it. And then that thing that justifies my belief, we're going to call it Y. And then you say, well, okay, well then Y is some other belief you have. What's your justification for that? And then you say, okay, well it's Z. So then, somebody can sort of keep pushing you down that trail of justification.
Right.
And you've got to end it somewhere. If you end it just by saying, well, because I just know that and I don't need a reason.
Right.
That's foundationalism, right? That reason without a reason is your foundation.
Right.
If you justify something by something that's already been in that loop, then you are sort of doing circular reasoning, and that's coherentism.
Right.
Or you just say, just let it run infinitely. That's infinitism.
Right.
Right.
And the problem is that supposedly none of those are acceptable solutions.
Right.
Because foundationalism is dogmatic, coherentism is circular, and infinitism is regressive. You never actually get to anything that you know.
Right. And this is basically, this is an argument that I'm interested in because, the skyhook is probably the strongest argument that I know of against skepticism. Mm-hmm. This, I think, is one of the strongest arguments that I know of in favor of skepticism. Yeah. Right. So.
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, when I teach this to my students, because I love the trilemma, and I say I give them those three options. But I said, but then the fourth option is the conclusion that therefore we don't know anything. That's skepticism. But skepticism is a problem because how do you know skepticism is true? Well, if you don't have a reason for it, then you're not. You don't have a reason for accepting the skepticism. So the skepticism ends up being self-defeating. So you have four possibilities, one of which is just the denial of the other three, and none of them are acceptable.
Right.
And my God, I love epistemology. I love that. That just makes my heart sing.
So what do you take? Which one do you take?
I can't get myself to not be a foundationalist. Coherent, some of the smartest people that have ever lived have been coherentists.
Such as who?
Blanchard. Lawrence Bonjour, interestingly, was a coherentist. And he very publicly said, you know what, it doesn't work. I'm a foundationalist now. Uh-huh. You can trust him, okay? Nicholas Rescher, who's brilliant, The joke about Nicholas Rescher is a student comes to see him and the secretary says, I'm sorry, you can't see him right now. He's writing a book. And the student says, oh, it's okay, I'll wait. Because he writes a book every day, it seems.
That's great.
Yeah, but but really intelligent people that you should be humbled to be skeptical of are coherentists. But I can't get it. Foundationalism and that's the majority view throughout history and still the majority view.
Foundationalism?
Foundationalism. Seems to, at least that's what everybody says, that right. Foundationalism is still the majority view. And I incline heavily towards foundationalism. But, and infinitism, I haven't read enough of Peter Klein to really, I'm sure, he's scary smart, okay? So I can't really criticize it. I don't know enough about it. The problem I have with coherentism and infinitism is the same thing. It's that your belief is appropriate by virtue of its relation to another belief, which supposedly is appropriate. But then that belief is only appropriate by virtue of its relation to another belief. And if it's a circle, like coherentists, then you never actually get to an appropriate belief, because everything's appropriate only in relation to another belief. And with infinitism, you never get to an appropriate belief either. So you never actually arrive at it's like some of the cosmological arguments, right? If you have this, you see this light. Where's this light coming from? Well, it's reflecting off that mirror. Okay, but where's it coming from to hit that mirror? It's reflecting off another mirror. Okay, but where is it coming from? Well, the mirrors are in a circle. That's where the light is coming from. It's just reflecting off the mirrors in a circle. Well, no, obviously not. Where does the light come from? A circle of mirrors could be in the dark. Where is the light coming from? Right. Or if it goes on to infinity. Okay, an infinite chain of mirrors could be in the dark. Where is the light coming from?
Right.
And that's the same thing here. I think the problem with coherentism and infinitism is that you never actually get to knowledge. That's my personal problem that I'm trying to work out.
Now, somebody somebody could say, I feel inclined to say, I don't have a resolution for the Agrippan trilemma. I'm up against the wall with that one. Mm-hmm. Maybe someday I'll deal with it. But, everything you're saying makes sense. But at the same time, I also want to say, okay, but if you take the foundationalist mm-hmm. route, then you have to admit that there's some piece of knowledge that you have without justification. And so what makes it knowledge if it's not justified? Well,
you wouldn't say it's without justification. You just say it's not based on another belief.
So it's self-justified.
Right. In fact, even that wouldn't be the right way to put it. But but that's how everybody says it. So you're right in saying that, yeah. The idea is that it's not that you just stop randomly. It's that you have a belief that does not have to be justified by reference to something else. And Descartes calls these clear and distinct ideas. Plantinga calls them properly basic ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't need to base that. Now the problem that leads to, for Descartes especially, is like, well, then you could be in error about it, and that sabotages the Cartesian project.
Right.
But Plantinga's epistemology is so interesting because he rejects infallibility as a condition of knowledge. He's a fallibilist foundationalist. So he says, could the foundation be wrong? Oh yeah, of course, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it could be, yeah. And if you have reason to reject it, then you're rejected. So, and a lot of his critics don't realize this. I mean, his epistemology really makes some excellent points in this regard. I don't like naturalized epistemology, but I'm trying to make him. I'm trying to withstand his arguments to not convert to naturalized epistemology. It's difficult sometimes.
So, the idea then is you take a foundationalist approach, and you start with some knowledge that is sort of immediate.
Right.
You could put it that way, right?
Right.
And so you take that as your foundation. You don't actually have a justification for that bottom level belief other than just the fact that it's immediate.
Mm-hmm.
And you admit that actually you could be wrong. So
Right.
you have an epistemology that's based on beliefs, but they're not certain.
Well, let me put it to you this way. Let's take one of these, like a sensory experience or memory belief or reflection. I mean, a sensory belief. I'm looking out there and I see this white pillar out in the library, okay? Like, do I have to have a reason for why I think there's a white pillar there? And not that it seems to me that there's a white pillar there. My senses are usually reliable, therefore there's probably a white pillar. That wouldn't be why I believe it. I believe it because I just see it. And
Right.
I just see it is not a defense of it. It's just a statement of the fact that I directly perceive it.
Right.
Now, the question to me becomes, would it be rational to doubt that without a reason to doubt it?
Yeah.
What would be faced with this, what would be the rational response? To believe that there's a white pillar there, or to be skeptical of it until I have an additional reason to accept it?
Right.
And I think it would be irrational to be skeptical about it. That's what I'm saying. I think it would be irrational to be skeptical about it until I have a reason to accept it. Right? I mean, so properly basic beliefs like this, the idea here is and sometimes it goes, like if I directly perceive the laws of logic, for example. So if somebody says, how do you know that there can't be a married bachelor? And I say, well, to wonder, maybe it's possible that there's a married bachelor, it doesn't strike me as merely irrational. It strikes me as borderline insane.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have to give you a reason for it.
Mm-hmm.
It would be, the rational thing to do is just accept that belief. And the irrational thing to do would be not to accept that belief and look for some external justification for it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's certainly the case, especially if you say, not do I have a reason to doubt that there's a white pillar there, but if you make it even weaker and say, do I have a reason to doubt that I have the impression of a white pillar
Yeah,
there?
right. Yeah,
then it becomes really, really difficult
Yeah.
to doubt it.
Although recently, I got to tell you, I write a blog, and I recalled something once in my younger days. I was at a party and I fell asleep. I won't say passed out. I fell asleep on the floor, and apparently my mouth fell open, and I woke up to something being placed in my open mouth on my tongue and a bunch of laughter around me. And I guess maybe foreseeing that I would someday be a philosopher, I thought, let me see if I can tell what this is without looking at it first. But then there was a problem because I was like, this hurts. They put something, this actually is causing me pain. Oh, no, it's not. No, it's, oh, yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, I couldn't tell if I was in pain.
Wow.
And it seemed like a long time, but it was probably just like 3 or 4 seconds. There was a piece of tissue paper, they just put some minty toothpaste on it. That's what it was. There was the sharpness of the mint.
Uh-huh.
I couldn't tell if I was in pain. That's one of the things that people say you couldn't be wrong about.
Mm-hmm.
You could be wrong about whether there is actual damage being done, but you couldn't be wrong about feeling pain. I couldn't tell whether I was in pain or not. That's crazy.
Well, see, I think that the only way, so I've thought about this, can you doubt your immediate experience?
Yeah.
And I think that there's like a weird transcendental thing that happens there, because I don't think it makes sense to quite doubt the actual sensory experience
Mm-hmm.
that you have. But the thing is, the sensory experience that you have is just sensory experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a proposition that that sensory experience is happening. It's not a proposition
that's
that
true,
that sensory experience exists.
Right.
So I think while I can't quite doubt the sensory experience itself, you might be able to doubt
The proposition.
however it is that you frame it as a statement. And I think the only way that I could see of having justification for doing so is to say that there could be a problem in the translation. Essentially in saying, I don't necessarily doubt sensory experience as such, but I can doubt the the coherence of the language that I'm now using to recreate it or to make a statement about it.
Yeah, that's true. You can doubt it, but again, Plantinga's position is that you could be wrong, but unless you have a defeater for it, it's inappropriate to not believe it. It's irrational to not believe it, or it can be irrational to not believe it. It's like what I said earlier, that you can see, or I didn't say this, I guess I was thinking it, that you can see the epistemological skyhook as kind of a defense of the principle of credulity. You have to start by taking things as they are until you have reason to doubt them. You can't start by by doubting them until you have a reason to believe them, because then that reason to believe them, you should itself doubt until you have a reason to believe it. But then you have to you'd be skeptical of that until you had a reason, so you can never get anywhere. But it's not even just that. Maybe we can just sit there. You can't, because that ends up being self-defeating. Right? So you have to start from the principle of credulity, that things are what they are until you have a reason to think that they're not, which happens all the time, right? It's just you can't start from that position.
What do you think about pragmatic attitudes towards epistemology? So attitudes towards epistemology that say, well, look, the problem here is actually that we're framing this all in this abstract notion of knowledge and truth. Really, we're animals. We have sort of goals, and language is a tool. Rationality, whatever it is really a tool, an emergent tool, coming in kind of evolutionary imperatives. And so, the reason it seems so troubling to be in this skeptical situation is because you want this abstract certainty, but really the way epistemology works is that we're drawn to the kinds of beliefs and attitudes that are actually just useful.
That has something to be said for it, definitely. And as an objection to the skyhook arguments, I think it has some bite to it. The problem is that for it to work against the skyhook, I don't know if that's what you're asking, but that's
it is.
Yeah, okay. To work against the skyhook, you'd have to say it's because you could say that the belief content doesn't matter as long as it leads to the right behavior, then that counts as a true belief. Now the problem I have, it would have to be a very specific and unusual form of pragmatism. It would have to be a pragmatism that says not what's useful for us to believe, but what was useful for our evolutionary forebears to believe. That way you could, but that seems so. Why would what is useful for someone else be our definition of truth, or our definition of knowledge?
I see. So if you follow the pragmatist line, then the truth is whatever was useful to believe back when our language was first being created.
Yeah, whatever was useful for other beings, maybe even another species, but basically whatever was useful for someone else is our definition of truth and knowledge. That seems unusual. That seems very. Now, again, I don't mean to dismiss it. It has a lot going for it. A lot of really intelligent people have been pragmatists. That's one of the glorious things that American philosophy has produced.
Yeah.
But I'm not a pragmatist. I think that truth can't be reduced to that, and knowledge can't be reduced to what's useful, because it's fairly easy to conceive of useful things that aren't useful beliefs that aren't true.
All right, I have one more question for you.
Okay.
So at the beginning of this, you mentioned a religious experience.
Right.
And I can't help but ask, because that's something that I'm very curious about. What was it like? What were the actual contents of it? And
I had gone through an incredibly stressful year, immediately following an incredibly stressful life. And basically the weight had been taken off, And a week and a half later, I was sitting in a chow hall, and it was like a divine download. The two ways I've described this to people is that I had information directly put into my mind. Mm-hmm. The other way is that it's like my eyes were, like I'd been squinting so hard I could barely let anything through all my life, and then for a moment they were completely open and then closed again.
Wow.
And it was contentful. It was basically, I carried you through the last year. And that was not only humbling, it's in retrospect, I realize the suffering that I went through that year was largely self-imposed, mm-hmm. right?
So who was the I there?
I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just, I carried you through the last year. And I was like, oh, okay, well, now I'm no longer agnostic, at least in the sense of not knowing whether God exists or not. Now I think God exists, but I don't know which, if any, religion is true. And then I was in Hawaii, and a friend of mine was inviting me to church, and I kept saying no. And I had nefarious reasons. I mean, in Hawaii, people don't wear as much clothing, and he said there's a lot of women in church, so I went. And while I was there, they were doing communion, and I had another divine download that said, I want you to take part in this.
Wow.
And I said, hell no. And I got up and I walked home 2 miles or so. And I just spent the next, like I said, 2 or 3 years trying to refute Christianity. Because my sense of Christianity was that it was on the same level as believing that the earth was flat. What would you do if you received a divine revelation that the earth is flat? I mean, what do you do with that? Now, obviously, in retrospect, obviously, the appropriate conclusion would be maybe your assessment of Christianity is at fault. Mm-hmm. But that never even occurred to me. It's not like it occurred to me and I dismissed it. I couldn't be wrong. Never occurred to me. And now I teach science and religion. But, so I spent a long time trying to refute it. And the first couple of years that I was a Christian, I loathed it. I loathed being a Christian. People would come up to me and try to give me leading questions like, don't you feel, this is one of the only joys I had at the time, that don't you feel like you've come home, like your life is fitting in place, like you belong? And I was like, no, I'd rather be dead, but thank you for asking. Any other leading questions? It's a great joy of me to bring people down that way. But I'm feeling much better now. And I'm just inherently antisocial anyway, I think. But after a few years, I got a little emotionally attached to Christianity, so I'm not hostile towards it anymore. But I still love reading anti-Christian literature. I mean, like I said, Planning is one of the only theistic philosophers I enjoy reading because I don't know why I enjoy him, but I like reading non-theists because they're more interesting to me as a theist. Non-theists are more interesting. I mean, I know what I believe. I don't need other people to just repeat what I'm thinking already. It's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always, if you have a really like sort of philosophical disposition, then you're probably going to be the kind of person who goes after the counter arguments, right? Who goes after people who don't agree with you, because that's where the juice is.
Yeah, I guess I did. I mean, I didn't. That's how I got into philosophy. That's how my career as a philosopher is my ongoing attempt to refute Christianity. It's just at this point I'd be a little sad if I did.
Right. Right, if at this point you were like, oh man, I was actually right like 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'd be sad if I was successful in that, but
And at this point, where do you feel like you stand with Christianity? You identify as a Christian.
Yeah, my wife hates it, but I just call myself a born-again, Bible-thumping Jesus freak. That's what I call myself. My wife loathes that. But yeah, I like Bible thumper. I'm just a Bible thumper.
Gotcha.
I mean, I originally started getting into theology to see if I could study historical Jesus research, but there's so many other things you have to study with theology. So I ended up going into philosophy instead. And philosophy, what I love in philosophy is not so much the philosophy of religion, it's the epistemology and philosophy of mind to a lesser extent.
Right.
And I love philosophy of religion too, but it's the epistemology that gets my heart beating faster.
Yeah. I know for my part, I was religious when I was young, when I was a kid, and eventually stopped believing. It was an interesting process. I remember for a couple of years, I would actually pray to God, and this is funny because it's the kind of self-defeating thing that we talk about. I would actually pray to God and apologize for no longer believing. Like, because I still had that sort of sense like he does, but the beliefs weren't there.
One of my professors he's Belgian, and in Belgian, if you ask a Belgian if they're Catholic, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I was born in Belgium." Right? It's just one of those things. And he became an atheist, and he had to join I guess the military or something. And he had his dog tags made, and he had atheist put on there, and it haunted him. And he went back and had them remake it as Catholic, even though he didn't really believe anymore. He couldn't bring himself to call himself an atheist.
Wow.
Even though he didn't believe it anymore. And it's for some people, it's like that. I mean, I know a lot of people who don't believe in, or I know people who don't believe in God or don't believe in Jesus or something like that, but consider themselves Christian. And that's, to me, coming at it from the outside, I'm bewildered by that. Why? What's the point of it? I mean, the only reason I have for believing in God and believing in Christianity is God and Jesus, right? I don't.
Right.
But it's.
Well, I think if there's anything to take away from it is that varieties of religious belief, I think, are much greater than people realize. Like the different kinds of attitudes towards believing in religion I think are just more varied than people.
Okay, two things then.
Yeah.
First, Flanagan in his book Warranted Christian Belief, and he just published like a year ago a smaller version of this, just Knowledge and Christian Belief, I think. He addresses that because that's an objection. One of the objections to his epistemology is he calls it the Great Pumpkin objection, because he says belief in Christianity can be properly basic. I don't need to offer a defense of it. He's been saying this shouting this for 50 years in the halls of analytic philosophy. He says, I don't need to defend it until you give me a reason to think it's not true. I mean, the coyones on this guy. And but one of the objections people raise is, well, if that's the case, then it would be the case for any other system. I mean, why couldn't somebody say my belief in the Great Pumpkin is properly basic?
Right. Or Russell's Flying Teapot.
Right. And I'm not going to go into it, but he has that. He responds to that in a similar one he calls Son of Great Pumpkin. So that's an interesting place for you to look. Second, I would just say read C.S. Lewis. Read C.S. Lewis. I mean, it's not that for me, it's not that he convinced me that Christianity was true. He just made it seem so damn reasonable. It just made sense. I was like, oh, so I don't have to reject evolution? I can think that the earth is round? That's amazing. That's incredible. That's amazing. That's actually being a little flippant about it, but he actually, it makes sense what he says. It does, again, that's not what convinced me that it was true. It just convinced me that it wasn't crazy, Yeah.
I find philosophers who are in the tradition of dealing with their faith to be just generally really fascinating. So I've mentioned existentialists before, and I value the existentialists a lot, and I think one of the best versions of Christianity that I've seen is just from reading Dostoevsky, actually.
Oh yeah. No kidding. My wife just finished reading Crime and Punishment for like the 5th time. Yeah.
I don't know. There's just after I told you as a kid I kind of got over Christianity, and then for a long time I just thought I don't even need to think about it. It seems kind of arbitrary. And Dostoevsky was the first person who I read who made me sort of feel like I could see this as compelling. Like, wait a minute.
I think Nietzsche said somewhere that Dostoevsky was the only Christian he had to take seriously. Yeah, so I totally see that.
Yeah.
I mean, he's really, his writings can be really devastating. So yeah, I completely understand that. But it depends. I mean, like Thomas Nagel was saying, in my opinion, he's the greatest living philosopher. I think he's brilliant, and he's an outspoken atheist. So it's not like I think that I'm just by the fact that I'm convinced by some of these arguments that therefore the people who aren't on my level. Right. They're way above my level, But I got to go with what I think is working.
Yeah, that's another interesting epistemological question for another time. Is how you get away with believing your own views without thinking that you are the smartest person on the planet. You know what I mean? Like, I'm good, dumb, man. So why am I right about anything?
You can defer to authority on many occasions, but sometimes you don't. And you got to have a good reason to think the authorities are wrong, but don't you think the authorities have thought of that already?
Right.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. That's another one. All right, Jim, thank you so much.
Yeah,
this
thanks,
has been an
man.
awesome conversation. So one last thing. So you're working on this book about Plantinga. Do you have any plans yet for release or anything? Or is it still too
Well,
early
I
stages?
submitted it to the outline to Routledge, who published the Epistemological Skyhook, and I haven't heard back, but they've signs are looking positive, and then when I hear back from them, I can get underway and kick it out as quick as I can.
Cool.
Yeah.
What's the title going to be?
Naturalized Skepticism.
Naturalized Skepticism.
Right, because naturalized epistemology, this is a very obnoxious title, because naturalized epistemology is an attempt to have epistemology without addressing the skeptical issues. And once you have naturalized epistemology, they say, oh, you can have naturalized ethics, you can have naturalized everything.
Uh-huh.
And so I say, yeah, you can have naturalized skepticism, which kind of undermines the whole program, because now you can't have the whole strength of naturalized epistemology is that you don't get the skepticism.
Right.
I'm saying Plantinga's argument is a form of skepticism that applies to naturalized epistemology.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Cool. I'm going to be looking forward to that. That sounds like right up my alley. All right. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Thanks.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shaves the Barber? Next week, I'll discuss how the Stanford Prison Experiment, along with some insights about collective states of mind, can help us to identify the ontology of the state. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.